We've come to chapter 4 in Charles Williams' book, Descent into Hell, and that chapter is titled Vision of Death. And you'll see a little later in the chapter that refers to Margaret Anstruther, who's having the visions and is peacefully awaiting death. We saw some introduction to Peter Stanhope in the first chapter, the Magus Zoroaster, and then Pauline Anstruther, who was in town because she's taking care of her grandmother, who's in her 90s and will be a little more introduced in the chapter today. And Pauline is frightened of this apparition of herself, which she has seen 9 times in her first 24 years and then 9 times in the 2 years since she has come to Battle Hill. So that's all introduced in the first chapter. In the second chapter, via Mortice having to do the deadly way, gave us an introduction to the unnamed man who was the humorous butt of everyone's joke, who was such a pathetic figure. Nobody bothered to know his name, and his name is never given in the book. And he commits suicide. And at the end of that chapter, he's kind of wandering around in some limbo. God has been merciful to him in some way, allowing him to kind of recollect himself. And that will come a little later in the book as well. And then last chapter, chapter 3, Quest of Hell, we were introduced to Lawrence Wentworth and his relationship to Adela Hunt, which is also connected to Adela's boyfriend, Hugh Prescott. And we talked about how Lawrence Wentworth is a character who's beginning to kind of lose his edge. He's making bad decisions in his life, fudging in his scholarship, carrying on this flirtation with Adela, and it will lead to some bad choices in his situation. And now in chapter 4, we're introduced to Margaret Anstruther. You know, she's a descendant of that John Struther, who was martyred there between the manor house and the village, set to fire at a stake during the reign of Mary Tudor in the 1500s. And so that is remembered as Margaret Anstruther picks up the book and reads a passage of that in her conversation with Pauline in this chapter. But let's start right where the chapter begins, and that is Pauline is out in the garden with her grandmother in the back of the house, and there's a fence around the house. And she is practicing her lines for the play. She's going to be the leader of the chorus. And she has the typescript on her knee, and she's practicing the verse, and it's some difficult language, so she has to keep working at it. And she's having conversation with her grandmother, who pauses and says to her in quite a wonderful way, "My dear, I hope you will not let my death get in the way of your performing this play." And so, you know, Pauline doesn't know what to say, but she tries to suggest that won't look very good, and wonders if her grandmother is feeling worse and all the rest. And the grandmother just assures her that she's fine, but she doesn't want her granddaughter, to be interrupted by her death. She feels the play is important and her granddaughter is important, and she kind of makes her promise that she won't miss the play just for her, which is rather interesting. And then they talk a little bit about verse and about Peter Stanhope. And Margaret Anstruther says Peter Stanhope is a great poet. And she, in fact, encourages Pauline to seek him out about the proper way to do the verse and use the elocution that they talk about. And in that bit of conversation, they talk a little bit about their ancestor, John Struther, And Pauline is talking about how that was a terrible thing. He was martyred, and he was put to the stake. And Margaret Anstruther says, salvation is often a terrible thing, a frightening good. And then Pauline responds that Peter Stanhope had said something similar, and they have a conversation about Peter Stanhope. And then Phoebe, who's kind of the household maid, I guess, comes out into the garden to announce that Mrs. Lily Samil has come to visit and pay a call on Margaret. And they're not real familiar, but this woman comes in, and so we're introduced to her. And in the pages that follow as she is coming to visit, this Lily Samil appears to just show up, wandering around town, tramping around, but she's described as younger than Margaret Anstruther. But Pauline detects in her that she looks like more living death than her grandmother. So there's something about her that is hinted at here in that connection. And she seems very uncomfortable. She's there to pay her respects to Margaret, but she seems to really want to talk to Pauline. And she talks to Pauline about how she, Lily Samil, can make Pauline's life better, can teach her to have good dreams, and can help her to control her life and all the rest. And we were just given a little clue here that this woman is kind of representative of the wrong, of the evil. And the whole business of Lilith and that mythology of Adam's first wife, we'll get to that later. But there are people who kind of are more in league with Satan, and they are encouraging people to accept illusions, and that seems to be what this person is doing. But while they're having that conversation and they're talking about that, then it appears that Peter Stanhope has been on his way, and he joins Myrtle Fox, who was on her way to visit Margaret Anstruther, and so they're introduced as well. And they're all out there in the garden, and there's a conversation about the poetry. And Mrs. Samil is not particularly caring about the poetry, but Margaret Anstruther is, and she asked Peter Stanhope what you need to do good verse. And he said, why the four virtues: clarity, speed, courage, and humility. And that affects Pauline as she thinks about that. She thinks about Peter Stanhope, and she thinks about those virtues. And so Mrs. Samil takes her leave. Eventually, Peter Stanhope and Myrtle Fox take their leave. The two ladies left, Pauline and Margaret Anstruther, come back in the house, and they both lay awake that night. And the author Charles Williams remarks that they're in different places on this journey. And he explains that Margaret Anstruther is preparing for death. She is welcoming death. She is at peace with the concept of dying. And so she kind of walks outside herself, and as she lays there awake at night and enters into these visions, whereas Pauline is in kind of a different place. Her life is up in turmoil, and she's thinking about all these things that she's gone through, and with the play and all the rest, and her introduction to Peter Stanhope. So in this vision that Margaret Anstruther has while she's kind of walking in this veil between death and her life here, she sees these mountains and all the rest, and she perceives things. She sees the unnamed dead man walking in the midst of the unbuilt houses of the estate back many years before this. And she wonders about him. She sees him, and she hears the pitter-patter of his feet, and she has heard it for some time. Then she sees also she sees Pauline going down the street being frightened and seeing an apparition of herself and turning away from it. And so those things come to her in this vision as well. And I want to pick out just a few things beginning in page 48, if you would turn to that. In this section of the book and in these pages, Charles Williams walks away from the story a little bit to talk about societies and their relationship to death and their relationship to paying respect to those who have passed on and protecting the living. And he speaks on page 48 about barbaric, savage regions of the world and places in ancient times where death, and the places where you bury people are taboo. May not be just a coincidence that outside of Egypt, it's a long way out from the populated areas to where those tombs are and where those pyramids are that have the dead. And so Williams speaks about ancient societies having some fear about those who had died and about their remains, and so they kind of put that away. And then he talks about religious groups that came along later, having rituals to send the departed on, with requiem and hymns and all the other things. And he said that those rituals are not just to carry the dead on and for them, but they're also somewhat a protection for the living. Be at rest, you person that has died, and don't disturb us. We don't want ghosts and so forth. And then he talks about modern society. This is in the 1930s, but it's very similar today in that sense. In all of human history, we have moved to this point where we don't think about God much. We don't think about eternal life. We don't think about the departed and ghost all that much. We're materialistic. And so he talks about how they're just graveyards and people just can go through them and they're nearby and all the rest. And it is in Battle Hill. There's the cemeteries right there on the hill, and everybody can go to visit the people that have passed on their graves on an easy, short walk. And Williams suggested that we probably are not meant to be so on such friendly terms with those who have passed on. And then he talks a little bit about how we can trivialize that and how we ought to be more respectful of that. He talks about the Greeks saying, know thyself, whereas the Christians say, know love. And then he talks about how in our theology as Christians, those come together. So we know ourselves and we know God's love, and it's all part of the same thing. And he mentions that what happens is that Margaret Anstruther, she combines that know thyself and know the love by being aware of herself and the fact that she's going to die. And so I think we should remember that, and we should also think about the fact that that the dead man is now part of this connection with Margaret Anstruther, because that will come in the story later, as she will be the instrument whereby she carries his burden in this table of exchange later that will kind of provide some space for his salvation, which is interesting and beautiful. But continue to read, And we'll move on through this, and I think you will find the book quite fascinating as we move on to the chapters where more things happen. Charles Williams' Descent into Hell, Chapter 4, Vision of Death. Pauline's parents had both died a few years before. She had been put in Battle Hill to live with her grandmother for 2 reasons. The first was that she had no money. The second was that her uncle refused to leave his mother to strangers. Since Pauline's mother had never liked her husband's parents, the girl had practically never seen the old lady. But the blood relationship in her uncle's mind connoted intimacy, and he found an occupation for an orphan and a companion for a widow in one stroke of mercy. Pauline was furious at the decisive kindness which regulated her life. But she had not, at that time when it interfered, found a job, and she had been so involved with getting to Battle Hill that she discovered herself left there at last with her grandmother, a nurse, and a maid. Even so, it was the latent fear in her life that paralyzed initiative. She could respond, but she could not act. Since they had been on the hill and the visitations had grown more frequent, she felt that deep paralysis increasing, and she kept her hold on social things almost desperately tight. Her alternative was to stop in altogether, to bury herself in the house, and even so to endure day by day the fear that her twin might resolve out of the air somewhere in the hall or the corridor outside her room. She hated to go out, but she hated still more to stop in, and her intelligence told her that the alternative might save her nothing in the end. Rigid and high-headed she fled, with subdued fury of pace, from house to gathering and back from gathering to house, and waited for her grandmother to die. Her grandmother, ignoring the possible needs of the young, went on living, keeping her room in the morning, coming down to lunch, and after a light early dinner, retiring again to her room. She made no great demands on her granddaughter, towards whom indeed she showed a delicate social courtesy. And Pauline in turn, though in a harsher manner, maintained towards her a steady deference and patience. The girl was in fact so patient with the old lady that she had not yet noticed that she was never given an opportunity to be patient. She endured her own nature and supposed it to be the burden of another's. On an afternoon in early June, they were both in the garden at the back of the house. The walls that shut it in made it in a part of the girl's security. Pauline was learning her part, turning the typescript on her knees and shaping the words with silent lips. The trouble about some of them was they were so simple as to be almost bathos. Her fibers told her that they were not bathos until she tried to say them, and then it was no good denying they sounded flat. She put the stress here and there. She tried slowness and speed. She invoked her conscious love to vocalize her natural passion, and the lines made the effort ridiculous. She grew hot as she heard herself say them, even though she did not say them aloud. Her unheard melody was less sweet than her memory of Stanhope's heard, but she did not think of him reading, only of the lines he had read. They were simple with him. With her, they were pretentious and therefore defiled. She looked up at Mrs. Anstruther, who was sitting with her eyes closed and her hands in her lap. Small, thin, wrinkled, she was almost an ideal phenomenon of old age. Some caller a day or two before had murmured to Pauline on leaving, "She's very fragile, isn't she?" Pauline, gazing, thought that fragile was precisely not the word. Quiet, gentle, but hardly passive, and certainly not fragile. Even now, on that still afternoon, the shut eyes left the face with a sense of preoccupation, translucent rock. She was absent, not with the senility of a spirit wandering in feeble memories, but with the attention of a worker engrossed. Perhaps Stanhope looked so when he wrote verses. Pauline felt that she had never seen her grandmother before and did not quite know what to make of her now. A light sound came from the garden beyond. Mrs. Anstruther opened her eyes and met Pauline's. She smiled. "My dear," she said, "I've been meaning to ask you something for the last day or two." Pauline thought it might be hot in the afternoon that gave the voice that effect of distance. It was clear but small and from afar. The words, the tone were affectionate with an impersonal love. Pauline thought she might be talking to Phoebe, Phoebe being the maid, and at the same time realized that Mrs. Anstruther did so talk to Phoebe and to everyone. Her goodwill was diffused in all directions. Her grandmother lay in its way. A granddaughter lay in its way with all things besides, and it mingled with the warm sun in a general benediction. Pauline said, "Yes, grandmother." "If by any chance I should die during the next few weeks," Mrs. Anstruther said, "you won't let that interfere with your taking part in the play, will you? It would be so unnecessary." Pauline began to speak and hesitated. She had been on the point of beginning formality. "Oh, but," when she felt under the lucid gaze compelled to intelligence, she said slowly, "Well, I suppose I should have." "Quite unnecessary," Mrs. Anstruther went on, "and obviously inconvenient, especially if it were in the last few days, or the last. I hope you wouldn't think of it, but it was better to make sure." "It'll look very odd," said Pauline, and found herself smiling. "And what will the rest of them think?" "Well, one of them will be disappointed. The rest will be shocked but relieved," Mrs. Anstruther murmured. "You've no proper understudy?" "None of us have," Pauline said. "One of the others in the chorus would have to take my part, if I were ill, I mean." "Do any of them speak verse better than you?" Mrs. Anstruther asked with a mild truthfulness of inquiry. Pauline considered the chorus. "No," she said at last, sincerely, "I don't think so. I'm sure they don't. Nor Adela," she added with a slight animosity toward the princess. Her grandmother accepted the judgment. "Then it would be better for you to be there. So you'll promise me it will very nearly be a relief." "I'll promise certainly," Pauline said. "But you don't feel worse, do you, my dear? I thought you'd been stronger lately, since the summer came." "I have a journey, sir, shortly to go," Mrs. Anstruther quoted, "and a quieter starting place than our ancestor." "Our ancestor," Pauline said, surprised. "Oh, but I remember, he was martyred, wasn't he?" Mrs. Anstruther quoted again. "Then the said Struther, being come to the stake, cried out very loudly, 'To him that hath shall be given.' And one of the friars that went with him struck at him and said, 'Naughty heretic, and what of him that hath not?' And he shouted with a great laughter, pointing at the friar and calling out, 'He shall lose all that he hath, and again the Lord hath sent away the rich with empty bellies.' Then they stripped him, and when he was in his shirt, he looked up and said, 'The ends of the world be upon me.' And so they set him at the stake and put the fire to the wood. And as the fire got hold of him, he gave a loud cry and said, 'I have seen the salvation of my God.' And so many times till he died, which was held for a testimony that the Lord had done great things for them and him in the midst of the fire. And under the Lady Elizabeth, the place was called Struther's Salvation for many years." Mrs. Anstruther stopped. "Perhaps the Lord did," she said, "though I do not quite take Fox's word for it." Pauline shuddered. "It was a terrible thing," she said, "how he could shout for joy like that." "Salvation," Mrs. Struther said mildly, "is often a terrifying thing, a frightening good." "Ah," said Pauline and paused. "Mr. Stanhope said something like that." She ended. "Mr. Stanhope is a great poet," her grandmother answered, "but I don't think many of you possibly understand his play." "You may, I can't tell." Mrs. Perry understands it, all but the chorus, Pauline said, and Adela and Myrtle Fox understand even that. Mrs. Anstruther looked changed. She had been contemplating the fact of Stanhope's poetry with a gaze of awe. There entered into that awe a delicate and extreme delight. She said, "My dear, I used to know Catherine Perry very well. No one has destroyed more plays by successful production. I sometimes wonder, it's wrong, whether she has done the same thing with her life. It's wrong. She's a good creature, and she has behaved very well in all her unrehearsed efforts. But I feel she relies too much on elocution and not enough on poetry." Pauline meditated on this. "I don't think I quite understand. How's the elocution?" "You're a little inclined to it yourself, my dear," Mrs. Anstruther answered. "Your elocution is very just and very effective, but a certain breadth of the verse is lacking. No one could have been kinder to me than you have. We've done very well together. I as the patient and you as the keeper. That's what I mean by elocution." She turned on her granddaughter, eyes full of delight and affection. Pauline could only sit and stare. Then slowly a blush crept up in her face and she looked hastily away. "Ah, don't be distressed," the old lady said. "My dear, you've been perfect. You're in trouble over something, and yet you've always been kind. I wish I could have helped you." "I'm not in any trouble," Pauline said with a slight harshness, "except now Have I been stupid, grandmother?" "That," Mrs. Anstruther said, "was perhaps a little less than intelligent. Why do you refuse to lean?" "I don't," Pauline said bitterly, "but there's no—" She was at the point of saying no help in leaning. She recovered herself and changed it to no need to lean. "Oh, my dear," Mrs. Anstruther murmured gently, "that's almost like the speech days at my school. Ask Peter Stanhope to tell you how to read verse." Confused between metaphor, implication, and rebuke, and the voice that disseminated sweetness through all, Pauline was about to protest again when Phoebe came into the garden. She came up to her mistress and said, "Mrs. Lily Samil has called, madam, and wants to know if you are well enough to see her." "Certainly," Mrs. Anstruther said. "Ask Mrs. Samil to come out here." And as Phoebe disappeared, "Do you know her, Pauline?" Pauline, standing up and folding her typescript with a precision that was almost respect, said, "Hardly know. She meets one continually, and she's at things. She calls. I never met anyone who called on her. Now I come to think of it, I don't even know where she lives." "There are all sorts of places to live on this hill," Mrs. Anstruther said. And Pauline heard in the voice an undertone of ambiguity. For a moment her fear took her. She looked hastily around. There was no sign of her twin. "All sorts of places to live." "Many habitations," she answered with forced lightness, and went to meet the visitor who appeared from the house. Mrs. Samil was younger than Mrs. Anstruther, and much quicker in movement. She was much more restless. Her feet pattered on the path, her eyes glanced everywhere. She suggested by her whole bearing that time was in a hurry, and there was very little time for something. Perhaps the contrast of Mrs. Anstruther's repose heightened this excitement. She was shorter than Pauline, and her eyes looked up at the girl almost anxiously. She said, "I've only just looked in, but it was so long since I've seen you." "We met yesterday, if you remembered," Pauline answered, "but it was good of you to come." "I don't, I hope, intrude," Mrs. Samil went on as she shook hands with the old woman. Mrs. Anstruther murmured something vague, and Pauline said it more definitely. "Of course not, Mrs. Samil. We're delighted." "Such glorious weather, but trying, isn't it?" the visitor prattled nervously on, like a chicken fluttering around the glass walls of a snake's cage. "I always think any weather is trying, heat or cold, and it always seems to be one or the other, doesn't it?" "So pleasant," said Mrs. Anstruther politely. "Like sex, one can't imagine anything not one or the other, or of course a combination. If," Pauline added, valiant but aware of failure, "if we could make our own weather." Lily Samil slewed around a little towards her. "If we could," she said. "I thought yesterday that you were looking a little tired, my dear." Was I? Pauline answered. Perhaps I was, and added agonizingly, it's the spring I expect. The other looked at her, turning still a little more away from Mrs. Anstruther, and seemed to become a little quieter as she did so. She said, I do think the world's rather trying, don't you? I do, Pauline said with a heartfelt throb of assent, more earnestly than she knew. Very trying. It's certainly hot. She felt that three in the garden were too many, and wondered if her grandmother, in case she was feeling tired, ought to be offered an opportunity of going indoors. If June was this sultry, what would July be? The time was still, no sound came. A lifting palpitation took her. She shuddered. Her grave. Who walked on? Or was it from her grave, the thing she had so often seen, into which she knew now she feared to be drawn, to be lost or not to be lost, to be always herself at the enfeebled element in something else. Never yet within walls, but the heart crept around her, a preliminary invasion. The heat came over her through the walls, and after the heat it sent her. The violet sensation receded. She came to herself to find herself staring rudely at Mrs. Samil's face. It was a face that had been beautiful, rounded and precious with delight, sustained just sufficiently by its bones to avoid, for instance, Adela Hunt's hardly avoided, the reproach of plumpness. And it was still full in places by the ears and around the jaw, only the cheeks were a little macabre in their withdrawal, and the eyes in their hint of hollows around them. Pauline, stirred by the sad recollection of her other self, thought that Mrs. Samil looked more like death than her grandmother, much more like a living death, than which on this hill, where her own ancestor and so many others had died, what could be more likely? Mrs. Samil was saying softly, perhaps she's asleep. I don't want to wake her. You look so tired. If I could be of any use. Pauline, as she looked back, as she had been unjust to Mrs. Samil's eyes. They were not restless, as she had thought. They were soothing. They appealed and comforted at once. She said, I've had bad dreams. Mrs. Samil said, I've had them too sometimes, and Pauline almost felt that even her dream, to call it that, was less trouble than those other undescribed nightmares. But before she could speak, the visitor went on, but there are cures, you know. She had spoken perhaps a little more loudly, for Mrs. Anstruther's voice answered equably, there is, of course, sleep or waking. Is there anything else? Mrs. Samil looked round, and her answer held the suggestion of hostility. She said defensively, pleasanter dreams. On a hill like this, one ought to have a choice. There are so many. Pauline said, can you change dreams, Mrs. Samil? Oh, everyone can, the other answered. She leant forward toward Pauline and went on, there are all sorts of ways of changing dreams. She put a hand on the girl's. All tales of the brain. Why not tell yourself a comforting tale? Because they could never make up a satisfying end, Pauline said, and the tale wouldn't stop. No tale that I could think of. There was always something more that had to happen. I could never feel, not in my best tale, that I was certainly telling it. You must let me tell you tales instead, Lily Samil answered. Come and see me. I like to, but I don't think I know where you live, Mrs. Samil, Pauline said, and paused in the implied question. Mrs. Samil said, oh, we shall meet, and if we can't find a tale, we'll do it as well. Cross my hand with silver, and I'll not only tell you a good fortune, I'll make you one, like the Bible, wine and milk without money, or for so little it hardly counts. Pauline looked at Mrs. Anstruther. Mrs. Samil is offering us all we want without any trouble, she said. Shall we take it and be grateful? Exquisite rhetoric, her grandmother elusively answered, but faintly, and Pauline went on to her visitor. And would one always enjoy oneself then? Why not, Mrs. Samil said. Everything lovely in you for a perpetual companion so that you'd never be frightened or disappointed or ashamed anymore. There are tales that can give you yourself completely, and the world could never treat you so badly then that you wouldn't neglect it. One can get everything by listening or looking in the right way. There are all sorts of turns. Phoebe reappeared by Mrs. Anstruther's chair. "Miss Fox and Mr. Stanhope, madam," she said, and retired with a message. Pauline said as she stood up, "It'll be too wonderful," she said. "Aren't you rather tired, grandmother? Wouldn't you rather go upstairs and let me see them indoors?" "My dear," Mrs. Anstruther said, "as long as Peter Stanhope comes to see me, I shall receive him. At least until Mrs. Samil gives us the effect of Shakespeare without Shakespeare. Give me your arm." She stood up and, leaning on the girl, took a step or two forward as Myrtle Fox, followed by Stanhope, came into the garden and hurried across to her. "Dear Mrs. Anstruther, how nice to see you again," Myrtle said. "It seems such a long time, but you know how rushed one is. But I feel I must come today. Do you know Mr. Stanhope? We met in the street and came along together." Mrs. Anstruther allowed herself to be embraced and kissed without any further welcome than a smile. Then she held out her hand. "This is a great honor, Mr. Stanhope," she said. "I'm very glad to welcome you here." He bowed over her hand. "It's very kind of you, Mrs. Anstruther." "I've owed you a great deal for a long while now," she said, "and I can do no more than acknowledge it. But I'm grateful that I can do that. Do you know Mrs. Samil?" Stanhope bowed. Myrtle let out a new gush of greeting, and they all sat down. "I really came," Stanhope said, after a little interchange, "to ask Miss Anstruther if she had any preference in names." "Me?" said Pauline. "What sort of names?" "As the leader of the chorus," Stanhope explained, "I promised Mrs. Perry I'd try and individualize so far, for the sake of the audience, as to give her a name. Myself, I don't think it'll help much with the audience, but as I promised, I wondered about something French, as it's to be 18th century. La Lantaine or something like that. But Mrs. Perry was afraid that'd make it more difficult. No one would understand, she thought, why leaves, if there are leaves, should be Lantaine." He was interrupted by Myrtle, who leaned eagerly forward and said, "Oh, Mrs. Stanhope, that reminds me. I was thinking about it myself the other day, and I thought how beautiful and friendly it would be to give all the chorus tree names. It would look so attractive on the programs. Elm, ash, oak, the three sweet trees, hawthorn, weeping willow, birch, beech, chestnut. Do you see? That would make it all quite clear. And then Pauline would be the oak. I mean, the oak would have to be the leader of the English trees, wouldn't she?" "Do let Mrs. Stanhope tell us, Myrtle," Mrs. Anstruther said. "And you turn them into a cozy corner of trees, Myrtle," Pauline interjected. "But that's what we want," Myrtle pursued her dream. "We want to realize that nature can be consoling, like life and art. Even Mr. Stanhope's play. I think all art is so consoling, don't you, Mrs. Samil?" Mrs. Anstruther had opened her mouth to interrupt Myrtle, but now she shut it again and waited for her guest to reply, who said in a moment, with a slight touch of tartness, "I'm sure Mr. Stanhope won't agree. He'll tell you nightmares are significant." "Oh, but we agreed that wasn't the right word," Myrtle exclaimed. "Or was it, Pauline? Was it significant or symbolical that we agreed everything was?" "I want to know my name," Pauline said, and Stanhope, smiling, answered, "I was thinking of something like Periel, quite insignificant." "Seems rather odd," said Myrtle. "What about the others?" "The others," Stanhope answered firmly, "will not be named." "Oh," Myrtle looked disappointed. "I thought we might have had a song or speech or something with all the names in it. It would sound beautiful, and art ought to be beautiful, don't you think? Beautiful words and beautiful voices. I do think elocution is so important." Pauline said, "Grandmother doesn't care for elocution." "Oh, Mrs. Anstruther," Myrtle was beginning when Mrs. Anstruther cut her short. "What does one need to say poetry, Mr. Stanhope?" she asked. Stanhope laughed. "What but the four virtues? Clarity, speed, humility, courage. Don't you agree?" The old lady looked at Mrs. Samil. "Do you?" she asked. Lily Samil shrugged. "Oh, if you're turning poems into labor, but we don't all want to speak poetry, and everything's a simple thing for the rest of us." "We do all want to speak it," Stanhope protested, "or else verse and plays and all art are more of dreams than need be. They must always be a little so, perhaps." Mrs. Samil shrugged again. "You make such a business of enjoying yourself," she said with almost a sneer. "Now if I have a nightmare, I change it as soon as I can." She looked at Pauline. "I've never had nightmares since I willed them away," Myrtle Fox broke in. "I say every night, sleep is good as sleep is here. Sleep is good. And I never dream. I say the same thing every morning. Only I say life and instead of sleep. Life is good and life is here. Life is good." Pauline flashed a glance at Pauline. Stanhope flashed a glance at Pauline. "Terribly good, perhaps," he suggested. "Terribly good, certainly," Myrtle assented happily. Mrs. Samil stood up. "I must go, but I don't see why you don't enjoy yourselves." "Because sooner or later there isn't anything to enjoy in oneself," Stanhope murmured as she departed. Pauline took her to the gate and said goodbye. "Do let's meet," Mrs. Samil said. "I'm always about and I think I could be useful. You've got to get back now, but sometime you needn't get back." She trotted off, and as she went, the hard patter of her heels was the only sound that broke to Pauline's ears the heavy silence of the hill. The girl lingered a little before returning. A sense of what Miss Fox called significance hung in her mind. She felt indeterminately that something had happened, or perhaps was beginning to happen. The afternoon had been one of 100. The garden, a little talk, visitors' tea, yet all that usualness had been tinged with difference. She wondered if it were merely the play, or her concern with it, that had heightened her senses into what was no doubt illusion. Her hands lay on the top bar of the gate, and idly she moved her fingers, separating and closing them one by one for each recollected point. Her promise to her grandmother, death was not to interrupt verse. The memory of her ancestor, death swallowed up in victory, Struthers' salvation, Anstruther's salvation, elocution, rhetoric, poetry, Peter Stanhope, Lily Samil, the slight jar of their half-philosophical dispute, her own silly phrase, "to make your own weather," tales of the brain, tales to be told, tales that gave you something, gave you yourself in quiet, tales of the speaking of verse, tales of rhetoric of poetry, clarity, speed, courage, humility, or did they only prevent desirable enjoyment, as Lily Samil had hinted? One would have to be terribly good to achieve them, and terribly careful about the tales. She looked down the street, and for an instant she felt that it was coming. It coming. Clarity, speed, courage, humility. She must wait. She belonged to the chorus of a great experiment, the thing, not herself. The Magus Zoroaster, my dead child, met his own image walking in the garden. If those four great virtues were needed, as Peter Stanhope had proposed, even to say the verse, might Shelley have possessed them before he discovered the verse? If she were wrong in hating them, if they had been offered her as a classification, a hastening, a strengthening, if she had to discover them as Shelley had done and beyond them, she must go back. She pulled herself from the gate. Mrs. Samil had just reached the corner. She looked back, she waved. The gesture beckoned. Pauline waved back reluctantly. Before she told herself tales, it was needful to know what there was in verse. She must hear more. She was not offered more. The visitors were on the point of departure, and Mrs. Anstruther was certainly tired. She roused herself to beg Stanhope to come again, if he would. But no more passed, except indeed that as Pauline herself said goodbye, Stanhope delayed a moment behind Miss Fox to add, "The substantive, of course, governs the adjective, not the other way around." "The substantive?" Pauline asked blankly. "Good. It contains terror, not terror. Good. I'm keeping you. Goodbye, Periel." And he was gone. Later in the day, lying unasleep but continuing in her bed, Mrs. Anstruther also reviewed the afternoon. She was glad to have seen Peter Stanhope. She was not particularly glad to have seen Lily Samil, but she freely acknowledged, in the words of a too often despised poet, that since God suffered her to be, she too was God's minister and labored for some good by Margaret Anstruther not understood. She did not understand certainly what Mrs. Samael conceived herself to be offering. It sounded so much like Myrtle Fox, tell yourself tales. She looked out of the window. There would be few more evenings during which she would watch the departure of day. And the promise of rarity gave a great happiness to the experience. So did the knowledge of familiarity. Rarity was one form of delight and frequency another. And thing could even be beautiful because it did not happen, or rather the not happening could be beautiful. So long always as joy was not rashly pinned to the happening. So long as you accepted what joys the universe offered, it did not seek to compel the universe to afford you joys of your own definition. She would die soon, she expected, with hope and happiness, the discovery of the joy of death. It was partly because Stanhope's later plays had in them something of this purification and simplicity that she loved them. She knew that since they were poetry, they must mean more than her individual being knew. At least they meant that. He discovered it in his style, in words and in the manner of the words he used. Whether his personal life could move to the sound of his own lucid exaltation of verse, she did not know. It was not her business. Perhaps even it was not primarily his. His affair had been the powerful exploration of power after his own manner. All minds that recognized power saluted him. Power was in the strange chorus over which the experts of Battle Hill culture disputed, and it lay beyond them. There was little human approach in it, though it possessed human experience, like the dirge in Cymbeline or the songs of Ariel in The Tempest. It possessed only the pure perfection of fact, rising in rhythms of sound that seemed inhuman because they were free from desire or fear or distress. She herself did not yet dare to repeat the chorus. It was beyond her courage. Those who had less knowledge or more courage might do so. She dared only to recollect it, to say it would need more courage than was required for death. When she was dead, she might be able to say Stanhope's poetry properly. Even if there were no other joy, that would be a reason for dying well. Here more than in most places, it would be easy. Here there had through the centuries been a compression and culmination of death, as if the currents of mortality had been drawn hither from long distances to some whirlpool of invisible death. The distances might be very long indeed, from all places of predestined sepulchre, scattered through the earth. In those places the movement of human life had closed, of human life or human death, of the death and life which was an element in life, and of those places the hill on which she lived was one. An energy reposed in it, strong to affect all its people, an energy of separation and an energy of knowledge. If she believed the spirit of man at death saw truly what he was and had been, so that whether he desired it or not, a lucid power of intelligence manifested it all himself to him, then that energy of knowledge was especially urgent upon men and women here. Through all the world, it must press upon the world. She felt, as if by communication of woe not hers, how the neighborhood of dead troubled the living, how the living were narrowed by the return of the dead. Therefore, in savage regions, the houses of sepulchre were forbidden, were taboo. For the wisdom of the barbarians set division between the dead and the living were preserved. The wisdom of other religions in civilized lands had set sacramental ceremonies about the dying and dispatched the dead to their doom with prayers and rites which were not meant for the benefit of the dead alone. Rather, they secured the living against ghostly oppression. They made easily the way of the ghost into their own world and hurried them on their way. They were sped on with unction and requiem, with intercessions and masses, and the sword of exorcism waved at the portal of their exodus against the return of any whom those salutations of departure did not ease. But where superstition and religion failed, when cemeteries were no longer forbidden and no longer feared, where the convenient processes of cremation encouraged a pretense of swift passage, where easy sentimentality set up a pretense of friendship between the living and the dead, might not the new nearness turn to a fearful friendship in the end? But what if the dead were only anxious for the living to help them? Or what if the infection of their experience communicated itself across the too shallow grave? Men were beginning to know. They were being compelled to know. At last the living world was shaken by the millions of spirits who endured that further permanent revelation. Hysteria of self-knowledge, monotony of self-analysis, introspection spreading like a disease. What was all this but the infection communicated over the unpurified borders of death? The spirits of the living world were never meant to be so neighborly with the spirits of the other. Grant to them eternal rest, O Lord, and let their light eternal shine upon them. Let them rest in their own places of light, far, far away from us, their discipline and their endeavor. The phrases and prayers of intercession throb with something other than charity for the department. There is a fear for the living. Grant them rest, compel them to the rest, enlighten them, perpetually enlighten them, and let us still enjoy our refuge from their intolerable knowledge. As if in a last communication with the natural terrors of man, Margaret Anstruther endured a recurrent shock of fear. She recalled herself. To tolerate such knowledge with a joyous welcome was meant, as the holy doctors had taught her, to be the best knowledge of man, and so remained. The best maxim towards that knowledge was yet not the know thyself of the Greek so much as the know love of the Christian, though both in the end were the same. It was not possible for man to know himself and the world, except first after some mode of knowledge, some art of discovery. The most perfect, since the most intimate and intelligent, art was pure love. The approach by love was the approach to fact. To love anything but fact was not love. Love was even more mathematical than poetry. It was the pure mathematics of the spirit. It was applied also and active. It was the means as it was the end. The end lived everlastingly in the means eternally in the end. The girl and the old woman who lay both awake in that house under the midnight sky were at different stages on that way. To the young mind of Pauline, by some twist of grace in the operation of space and time, the Greek maxim had taken on a horrible actuality. The older vision saw, while yet living, almost into a world beyond the places of the dead. Pauline knew nothing yet of the value of those night vigils, nor of the fulfillment of the desire of truth. But Margaret had, through a long life, practiced the distinction not only between experience and experience, but in each experience itself between dream and fact. It is not enough to say that some experiences are drugs to the spirit. Every experience except the final has a quality which has to be cast out by its other qualities of perfection, expelled by healthy digestion into the sewers where the divine scavengers labor. By a natural law, Margaret's spirit exercised freely its supernatural functions and with increasing clearness looked out to the growing company of the hill. Lights in the houses opposite had long since been put out. The whole rise of ground, lying like a headland, or indeed as itself like some huge grave in which so many others had been dug, was silent in the darkness, but for one sound, the sound of footsteps. Margaret knew it very well, and she heard it on many nights, sometimes in the day as well, when the peace was deepest within her and without. She could hear the faint, monotonous patter of feet reverberating from its surface. Its distance was not merely in space, though it seemed that also, but in some other dimension. Who it was that so walked forever over the hill she did not know, though in her heart she did not believe it to be good. The harsh phrase would have been alien to her. She heard those feet not as sinister or dangerous, but only patter, patter as the haste of a search for or a flight from repose. Perhaps both. Ingress and regress, desire and repulsion contended there. The contention was the only equilibrium of the haunter of the hill, and was pain. Patter, patter. It sounded at a distance like the hurrying feet of the woman on her own garden path that afternoon. She had heard in old tales of magic of the guardian of the threshold. She wondered if the real secret of the terrible guardian was that he was simply lost on the threshold. His enmity to man and heaven was only his yearning to enter one without loss. It did not matter, nor was it her affair. Her way did not cross that other's, only it was true she never sank into those circles of other sensations and visions, but what far off she heard, patter, patter, the noise of the endless passage. There moved within her the infinite business of the hill into which so much death had poured. First there came the creation of new images instead of those every day. Her active mind still insisted on them. She allowed its due. The hill presented itself before her with all its buildings and populace. She saw them small and vivid, hurrying. She would even sometimes recognize one or the other from the briefest second. She had seen in that recreation by the night of the hill by day, Pauline going to a shop, and Peter Stanhope talking in the street, and others. She remembered how idly that she had never seen the woman who had called on her that day, though she had seen Myrtle Fox running hard down a long street. Distinct though the vision was, it was but momentary. It was the equivalent of her worldly affairs, and it lasted a little longer. In a second it had gone. It had enlarged rather. It reduplicated itself on each side, and its inhabitants faded from it as it did so, seeming themselves to pass into other hills. Presently there was no living form or building on that original hill, and it was no longer possible to tell which had been the original from a great range swept right across the sky. And all those heights were only the upper slopes of mountains, where lower sides fell away beneath her vision. The earth itself seemed to lie in each of those mountains. On each there was at first a populous region towards the summit, but the summit itself rose individual and solitary. Mountains or modes of consciousness, peaks or perceptions, they stood on the slopes of each the world was carried, and the final height of each was a separate consummation of the whole. It was, as the apprehended movement upon each of them died away, in that time before the dawn that they rose there, nor had the sun risen, though they were not in darkness. Either a light emanated from themselves, or some greater sun drew towards them from its own death. Then, it was not to say that they had faded, but rather that she lost them, becoming herself one of them and ignorant of the rest. It was very silent. Only small sounds came up to her as if someone was climbing below. The noises were so faint that in the air of earth they would have been lost. Had she been woman, she would not have known them. Nor that she was not woman alone, but mountain. The mountain knew that it was not from its own nature alone that the tiny disturbances came. There was movement within it certainly, rush of streams, fall of rocks, roar of winds through its chasms, but these things were not sound to it, as was that alien human step. Through all, another single note sounded once, a bell. Minutely she knew that the public clock of the hill had struck one. It was a remote translation of a thing, for the dawn began. It came from above, and the light grew the mountain that was so that she became aware of its fellows, spread out around no longer in a long range, but in a great mass. They stretched away on all sides. At the increase of the sun, there grew also an increase of fugitive sound, and she became aware of a few wandering shapes on the heights about her. Some climbed on, others, instead of welcoming the light as lost mountaineers should do, turned to escape it. They hurried into such caves or crevasses as they could find. Here and there, on a great open space, one lay fallen, twisting and dragging himself along. They seemed all, even those who climbed, grotesque obstructions in that place of rock and ice and thin air and growing sun. A world different from theirs, hers and not hers. A divided consciousness lived in her more intensely than ever before. In the time of her novitiate, it had seemed to her sometimes that, though her brains and emotions acted this way or that, yet all that activity went on along the sides of a slowly increasing mass of existence, made for herself and all others with whom she had to do. And that strong and separate happiness, for she felt it was happiness, though she herself might be sad, her sadness did but move on as the mountaineer on the side of the mountain. That happiness was the life which she was utterly to become. Now she knew that only the smallest fragility of her being clung somewhere to the great height, that she had others and all the world under their separate kind, as she herself was part of all the other peaks. And though the last fragility was still a little terrified by the dawn which was breaking everywhere, she knew that when the dawn reached the corner where she lay, it would, after one less throb of piercing change under its power, light but the mountainside, and all her other mighty knowledge would after its own manner rejoice in it. She had not much strength in those days. That which was Margaret Anstruther had lay in her bed on Battle Hill, but such as she had it was her business to use. She set herself to crawl out of that darkened corner towards the light. She turned from all that the corner held, her home, her memories, Stanhope's plays, Pauline. With Everett she began her last journey. It might take hours, or days, or even years, but it was certain as she moved, crawling slowly over the rock, she saw the light sweeping on to meet her. The moment of death was accepted and accomplished in her first outward movement. There remained only to die. On her way and in her bed, she dozed a little, and in that light sleep, dream within dream or vision within vision, she seemed to be walking again on the streets of Battle Hill, as if, having renounced it, it was restored to her. It was still night there. The lamps were lit in the streets. The rustle of the many trees were substituted for the silence of the mountains. The great mountains were there, and the lights of them and their inhabitants, though the inhabitants did not know the soil on which they lived. In a foretaste of acute senses of death, she walked among them, but they did not see her. Outside her own house, she saw Pauline come out and look bitterly this way and the other, and start to walk down the road. And presently, as if from the mountainside, another Pauline had grown visible and come to meet her, the first, her head high and bright as the summit, her eyes bright with the supernatural dawn, her movements as free and yet disposed as the winds that swept the chasms. She came on, her feet were which at first made no noise, beginning to sound on the pavement, and she took on more and more of the mortal appearance. And the first Pauline saw her and turned and fled, and the second pursued her. And far away down the dark streets and round the dark mountain, they vanished from sight. And then again, and now she was not by her own house, but in another street towards the top of a hill. She saw a man walking hurriedly on, a man strange to her, but after him followed a crowd of others, young men and children, and all of them with his face. They pursued him as the vision of Pauline had pursued the vision of Pauline, but this time with angry or plaintive cries, and he hurried on seeking something, for his restless eyes turned every way, and sometimes he peered at the gutter, and sometimes he looked up at the dark window, till presently he turned in at one of the gates, and about the gate his company seemed to linger and watch and whisper. Presently she saw him at a window, looking down, and there were at that window two forms who did not seem to see each other, but the second she knew, for he had been at her house once not long ago, and it was Lawrence Wentworth. He too was looking down, and after a little he was coming out of the gate, and after him also came a figure, but this time a woman, a young woman, who pursued him in his turn, for whom also he lay in wait. But the other man too had now come out into the street, only it was no more the street of a town, but a ruined stretch of scaffolding or bone or rock, all heights and edges and bare skeleton shapes. He was walking there on the mountain, though he did not know it, any more than he noticed the light. He walked and looked up and around, and her eyes met his, and he made a sudden movement of wonder, and she thought of joy. But as they looked, the dream, which was becoming more and more a dream, shifted again, and she heard quick and loud the patter-patter of those footsteps, with which, as if they marked a region through or around which she passed, such experiences always began and ended. She was on the hill, and all the houses were about her, and they stood all on graves and bones and swayed upon their foundations. A great stench went up from them, and a cry, and the feet came quicker. And down the street ran Lily Samil, waving and calling, and checked and stood. She looked at a gate. Pauline was standing there. The two neared each other, the gate still between them, and began to talk. No more hurt, no more pain, no more bad dreams, a voice said. Margaret Anstruther put out a hand, a touch of projection in the rock on which she was lying in her journey towards corporal death. She clung to it and pulled herself forward towards Pauline. The nurse in the room heard her and turned. Mrs. Anstruther said, I should like to see Pauline. Will you ask her? And at that she woke, and it was striking 1.